coming in. I got to be sharp on my time, so we're going to get started. So welcome to the seminar. We're going to talk about your feelings. Your last chance to leave, if you want to leave. Guys, I'm proud of you for being in here. I think guys need to be in here, so it's great to see some guys in here. So I'm trying to remember what I named the seminar. I tried to make it something that sounded like kind of okay and kind of cool, where people would actually come and maybe hide the fact we're going to talk about our feelings. But I think it's called "Do People Know the Real You?" Is that what I landed on? Yeah, "Do People Know the Real You?" and the importance of spiritual and emotional health. And I think, for anybody involved in Crew, you get and you've experienced the importance of spiritual health. I mean, we've kind of got the boxes to check. We learn how to read the Bible, and we do observation and interpretation and application, and we learn how to memorize Scripture, and we learn how to pray, and we learn how to share the gospel. And so we place a huge emphasis on spiritual health. But something that I think isn't often talked about is the importance of emotional health. And so I'll just kind of show my cards, and basically what I'm going to claim is I'm going to claim that if there's an element of emotional health with spiritual health in your life, there's going to be a lack of contentment. That's what I'd say. So I'd say a life marked with contentment just simply is not possible without spiritual and emotional health. That's my claim. And I would say that, I've really seen that in my own life in the past couple of years. So I think about this whole journey for me and this journey of learning about emotional health and what that looks like in my life. It started for me about 2 years ago when I was sitting in a counselor's office. And so just so you know kind of where I was at that day. So at that time I was 24. I'd been on staff for 2 years. And when we talk about being spiritually healthy and being spiritually mature, we probably have a list of some things that we would check off in our minds. And so, I'd had a great disciple. I had a great boss and taught me how to study the Bible, taught me how to do principle, explanation, application, and taught me how to pray, had taught me how to memorize Scripture. I was sharing my faith. I was on staff. I've been on staff for 2 years. And so if you were to look at my life and ask, does that guy seem spiritually healthy? I think that all of the boxes were being checked that would result in you going, yeah, I think so. Yeah, he seems pretty healthy in his spiritual life. The day when I was sitting in this counselor's office, I was sitting in this counselor's office because there were some things in my life I wasn't content with. There was some sin in my life that I wanted to be free from, and I simply wasn't. But even more so, I would say one of the reasons I was in that counselor's office was because honestly, I just consistently felt kind of isolated. I consistently felt unknown by people. And just kind of the typical sin pattern that I live my life out of, which I think is the kind of sin pattern we attract in Crew, is this very spiritual sin pattern of we put on this nice spiritual mask that we've got it all together and we've got it going on spiritually when on the inside we're maybe a little rotten. And so I just kind of consistently lived in this place where I'd say externally things look great, but I was sitting in a counselor's office honestly feeling kind of lonely and feeling kind of isolated and really kind of believing that if people really saw my motivations and my desires and how I love to elevate myself above other people because of the spiritual areas of life that I had mastered and conquered, they'd run for the hills. That's pretty much where I was at. So that's why I was sitting in a counselor's office, because in a sense I was knocking things out of the park spiritually, just when it comes to doing activities. But, I had the emotional maturity of a 5-year-old because people weren't seeing the real me. And there were motivations and desires that just simply did not have light shed on them. And so that's where I was at. And it's been kind of a journey the past couple of years, and so this is something that I'm pretty passionate about because I really do believe that without emotional health being true of you, a life of contentment just simply doesn't happen. Now, emotional health, what do I mean by that? We could just simply talk for a while about what's a good definition of emotional health. And one of my favorite definitions I've come across is in a book by Stephen Covey, and it's called 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. And it's just kind of a simple one-sentence definition. And this is the definition. He says that emotional health is the ability to express one's own feelings and convictions balanced with consideration for the thoughts and feelings of others. So emotional health is the ability to express one's own feelings and convictions balanced with consideration for the thoughts and feelings of others. Pretty good one-sentence definition, I'd say. Now, we want to flesh that out a little bit and maybe kind of talk a little bit about what that means. And so, I guess really my goal today is to help you see the importance of emotional health and to put some just kind of simple, practical things in your hands to kind of start you on a journey towards emotional health. Because it's probably new for most of us in the room. I bet some of us in the room have felt some of the things that I felt that day when I was sitting in that counselor's office, but we don't know what to do with it. And so I want to just put some things in your hands to kind of help you figure out, okay, what do I do with these things? How do I pursue emotional health? And so I want to share, I think, 3 things that are true of the person who is emotionally healthy. Okay? So 3 things that are true of the person who is emotionally healthy, who, like Stephen Covey said, is able to express that his or her own feelings and convictions while being considerate of others' feelings and convictions. So the first thing that is true of the emotionally healthy person is that the emotionally healthy person goes beyond just his or her behavior and gets to the heart. So an emotionally healthy person goes beyond his or her behavior and gets to the heart. Now, to explain that, I want to show you something that this counselor actually showed me that day when I was in his office. And this kind of revolutionized the way I view accountability. It kind of revolutionized the way that I view community. I always kind of said I had those things. I didn't really know what that meant. And he showed me this, and what he said to me, he said that for most people, when they think about accountability and they think about having honest relationships in their life, accountability happens for most people here. So the whole idea here, we have heart. Can y'all see in the back? I know my writing's a little small. So the idea here is that we start with the heart, and our thoughts are flowing out of our heart. So our thoughts, our desires are going to come out of our heart, and our behavior and our actions come out of our thoughts and our desires. And so what this counselor told me, he said that for most people, they view accountability and honesty and community as something that happens right here, kind of post-behavior. So your classic example of this, I was involved with this in college. I think your classic example of this is, and I'm not saying this is bad, but I want to see guys go beyond this. Classic example of this would be a group of guys who get together who are college students who keep each other accountable in pornography. And basically what that group looks like is you get together once a week and you share whether or not you messed up behaviorally that week. That's a good example, I think. So you get together once a week, you say whether or not you messed up behaviorally. And for most people, I think this is where accountability happens. It happens post-behavior. Now, when I was meeting with this counselor this day, he challenged me. He said, David, true accountability happens, he said it happens right here. He said it happens right here with a heart. And true accountability and real honest conversations don't happen here post-behavior, but they actually happen here when we see things that are off in our heart. I mean, this was pretty revolutionary for me. And he said, David, this isn't embarrassing. It kind of gets to a point where, we'll use porn as an example because it's such a common one with college students. It kind of gets to a point where it's really not that embarrassing to admit it anymore. But the things that are going on in your that lead to that are a little embarrassing. So I kind of took this whole idea and I really ran with it in my own life. I started doing this with some guys who were my age that I met through my church. I started doing this with some students that I met with on campus. And I just want to give you a couple of examples of what this looked like and man, I mean, this was a big deal for me, and it was a really big deal for some people I did this with. And so, to give you a couple of examples of what I mean by this, I remember these are kind of personal examples, but I have permission to share these from all the people who said these things. So don't worry. But I remember one day I'm sitting with a group of guys. We had talked about this, and I'm sitting with a group of guys who. And I don't mean to keep using this example, but like I said, it's a really common one with college students. But I'm sitting with a group of guys who all kind of struggle with pornography. And we were talking about this, and we were talking about what if we were to be honest with each other here when we see the heart stuff. And we kind of talked about that. So what would that look like for you? And I remember one guy, he said, man, and a question that I asked him, I said, so to help kind of figure out what that is for you, I said, think back to maybe the past couple of times you'd watched porn. Okay, what was true of your life? What were you feeling? What were you thinking? What were you wanting? What were the circumstances of your life? And so we talked about that, and this one guy, he said this. He said, man, I think about the past couple of times that I've watched porn, and I think about how I almost have this expectation in my head that if I'm doing my best to be a good, disciplined Christian, if I'm doing my best to read the Bible and pray and be with other believers and memorize Scripture, I almost have this expectation in my mind that if I'm doing my best to be a good, disciplined Christian, God's going to kind of meet me halfway. And He's going to meet me halfway by giving me these really good, bubbly, emotional feelings. But he said, there are just sometimes days and weeks and seasons where that's just not the case. There are times where I read my Bible, it feels like I'm reading a textbook. There are times when I pray and it feels like my prayers are hitting a brick wall. And there are times when I'm doing my best to be a good, disciplined Christian, but I just feel kind of numb. Like if I were to say how I felt, I would just say I feel numb. And so in that moment, I think about how God's just kind of disappointing me because I have this expectation He's going to meet me here and give me these particular feelings. He's not doing that. So then I think to myself, well, I just feel numb. The whole God thing's not working. Well, there's this thing over here that makes me feel something. Porn makes me feel something. I'll go do that. And so you see how it starts with the heart, and it starts with this expectation and right that is placed on God. And it leads to a thought or a desire. It leads to behavior. I'd say for most people, accountability happens here post-behavior. So the challenge is, what if accountability happened right here? What if it happened with the heart stuff? Another example of this, that same conversation, one of the guys said this. He said, I think about the majority of the times I watch porn are times late at night when I'm having a hard time going to bed. And when I think about why, and I think about what I was feeling, he said, honestly, what I'm feeling most of the time is I'm laying in bed, I'm having a hard time going to sleep, and I just kind of wish there was somebody there. I wish that I had a spouse. And I don't. And I kind of long for that kind of intimacy, and I don't have it. Well, this thing over here makes me feel something, so I'll go to that. It's a pretty real example. Same thing. Starts with the heart. Starts with a desire that is being unmet. And instead of dealing with that desire in the appropriate way of talking with God and people about it, it goes unchecked, becomes a thought. Thought becomes behavior. This is pretty radical. This is embarrassing to admit some of these things. But this is, I think, necessary for emotional health. And it's radical, but it is incredibly helpful of having conversations here. Instead of having conversations post-behavior, having conversations here when you see the things are off in your heart. So that's one thing I'd say. The emotionally healthy person pushes past behavior and gets to the heart. Second thing I'd say is that the emotionally healthy person has, I'd say, a general understanding of his or her past and how it affects them now. So the emotionally healthy person has a general understanding of his or her past and how it affects him or her now. Now, so what I mean by that, give an example from my own life. So I've always been the tall, lanky kid. And so I got picked on a lot when I was a kid. And I have all these very vivid memories in my mind of getting picked on the basketball court or getting picked on in class. And as a kid, you just kind of get these ideas in your head, and you start believing these lies that just kind of go unchecked. And so as a kid, when I got picked on so much, I kind of developed this idea that the real me was unacceptable. And the real me, instead of drawing people in, kind of pushed people away. And so, if I'm going to have friends, if I'm going to be accepted, well, I just got to put on the cool mask and hide the real me. And if I put on the cool mask the right way, well then people will move towards me. And so honestly, I did that in high school. And it worked. And I had friends. Kind of hid the real me, but I put on the mask that I thought people would like and accept. And it worked, and I got friends. So then I went to Ole Miss. And I would say that I became a Christian while I was at Ole Miss. And so while I was at Ole Miss, I got connected to a group of guys who, I would say, since I became a Christian at Ole Miss, it was the first time in my life I really did kind of experience community. And it was the first time in my life I had guys in my life who were really good, godly guys who, just like me, wanted to follow Jesus. And at that point in my life, those guys knew me better than anybody else on the planet. I had shared things with those guys that I had never shared with anybody else. I shared things about my past. I shared things about my motivations and desires that I had never shared with anybody before. And towards the end of my junior year and my senior year, a couple of those guys who I considered my best friends kind of slowly withdrew from my life and kind of quit answering the phone, kind of quit hanging out with me. And I felt like I was 10 again. And it kind of reinforced that idea I got in my head as a 10-year-old that the real me isn't acceptable. Because these guys in college, they had seen the real me better than anybody else in my life. And it seemed like what had happened was, in seeing the real me, these guys ran for the hills instead of moving towards me. And so then I really carried that baggage at UGA, and I've had some great friends that have worked through that stuff with me. But I share all that with you because I'm not asking you to be overly introspective. That's not my goal here. But I do think it's really important to have a general understanding of some of the big moments in your past and your life and how they affect your life now. Because here's an example. So a couple of weeks ago, I've got my boss at UGA. He's a dear friend. We have this cool relationship where he's my boss, but also a really good friend of mine. Well, a couple of weeks ago, I had this kind of weird experience with my boss where I'd called him, and I'd called him, and I wanted to talk to him about something, and didn't answer, never called me back. Well, okay, not a big deal, whatever. A couple of days go by, I called him again, talked to him about something else. Didn't answer, didn't call me back. And y'all, I kind of start freaking out on the inside a little bit. And I start making some crazy assumptions. Maybe y'all have done stuff like this before. I start making these crazy assumptions that my boss doesn't really care about our friendship. I'm just a guy who works for him. I'm not really his friend. I start assuming that he doesn't really care about our friendship, doesn't really care about our relationship, doesn't really like me that much. That he just kind of puts up with me because I'm on his team. I'm making these crazy, insane assumptions. And honestly, it kind of affected the way I interacted with my boss for a couple of days. And I could tell. I was a little freaked out, and I just wasn't being myself. And so I just kind of had to stop and go, man, what's the deal here? Like, why am I feeling these things? Why am I acting this way? And I kind of thought about it. I was like, I kind of feel like I'm back in college. I kind of feel like I'm 10 again. And I'm beginning to assume the same things that I assumed as a kid. Then when people see the real me, they run away. And so, what was happening was, I was taking a past experience and I was putting on a present one. I was taking this past experience from college where a couple guys quit answering the phone because they were kind of drifting away from me, and I was putting it on a present experience. And I was assuming that my boss wasn't answering the phone because he didn't like me, he didn't want anything to do with me. Which was a crazy assumption. It was an insane assumption, but I was doing it anyway. And I kind of think I was doing it because of some of the stuff in my past. So we sat down and we had a really helpful conversation about it. I told him a little bit about my past. I said, hey, this is what kind of happened for me in college, and this is kind of the way I've been feeling the past couple of days, and this is what I've been assuming. I know it sounds insane, but it's just kind of been the case. Kind of heard me out, and it was a really helpful conversation for me. And so for some of y'all, that may sound really intense and introspective. And but I think it's necessary for emotional health to just have kind of a general understanding of what are the big things in my past that kind of affect my life now. Because, I even say, too, for me, like I think about my life and I think about the most consistent temptation I feel in my life, and it's probably the temptation of Matthew 6:1, when Jesus said to beware of practicing your righteousness for other people, just in order to be seen by them. So the warning that Jesus gives is practicing your righteousness before people just so that they see you and praise you and think highly of you and think you're awesome. That's kind of the warning. That's kind of the temptation. Now, we could call that indwelling sin, and it absolutely is. But maybe even, too, my past has a little bit to do with that. Maybe the rejection I experienced has a little bit to do with that. And the pain of rejection is something I don't want to feel again, so I feel this consistent temptation to just put them out and hide the ugly things. So, I will say for me personally, a general understanding of my past has really helped me understand kind of who I am and how I got here. And being able to process that with other people and having other people know those things about me has been a really freeing thing. So I would say that is a necessary thing for emotional health. The last thing, third thing I would say, that is true of the emotionally healthy person, and I've basically already said this, but I need to state it clearly, and it's that the emotionally healthy person processes all this stuff, not just with God, but with people. So the emotionally healthy person processes all this stuff, not just with God, but with people. That's absolutely necessary to process this stuff with the Lord. I mean, I've talked with my boss before about how sometimes, I can have the tendency to process it with people before I can process it with the Lord. But I think it's sometimes easy for us to get this idea in our heads that it's just kind of a me and Jesus thing. As long as I got Jesus, I'm good. And I'd push back on that a little bit. I've got a roommate who we've kind of gone through this whole journey together. It's been kind of fun going through this together, and he did this kind of stuff for a long time, but he just kind of did it with God. Like my roommate was pretty good about, he'd sit down and just kind of, and we're going to look at this in a little bit, but he'd pull out a feelings chart, and he'd kind of go, this is how I feel today. And he'd kind of journal it, and he'd kind of pray through it with God. But a couple months ago, we started talking through this stuff together, and my roommate, he would tell you, he'd say, man, like, when I started processing this stuff, not just with God, but with people, like when I started processing this stuff, the heart stuff, when I started processing my past, not just with God, but with people, there was just a level of contentment and freedom that I never experienced before. And so I'd say that this is necessary for emotional health, to process this kind of stuff, not just with the Lord, but also with people. Now, what does that look like kind of practically? So, to give you an example from my own life, I sit down once a week. Actually, I'm going to go ahead and pass these out, and then I will share this with y'all. If you could take one and just kind of pass it around. I think I have enough. This is going to be really intimidating for some of y'all, but it'll be a good little exercise. This is the feelings wheel. So, I do this every week with a couple buddies. I have two guys from my church I do this with, and I also do this with my roommate. And what this looks like for us is we sit down once a week with the two guys from my church. We go to Waffle House, and we'll sit down, and we'll get this out if we need it. And we'll basically share these things. We'll say, hey, so this is how I've been feeling physically, this is how I've been feeling spiritually, this is how I've been feeling emotionally. And this is what I've been struggling with. So those 4 questions. So we talk about, this is how I've been feeling physically, this is how I've been feeling emotionally, this is how I've been feeling spiritually, and this is what I've been struggling with. If you've been struggling with something. You don't have to always be struggling with something, but this is the place where we have that conversation if that's the case. I do that with my roommate as well. And this is what it looks like for me to do this with people. And so I shared this with a buddy of mine a couple of weeks ago, and he was like, "Man, I think that'd be really helpful for me to do and to have in my life." And so he had talked with a friend of his about doing it together. So they sat down, they did this for the first time together, and he called me afterwards, and he said, "Hey, once you share that stuff for you, what kind of happens?" I was like, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, I shared that stuff, and the way my buddy instantly responded was he said, 'Oh, well, you should do this.'" I was like, yeah, we don't do that." and so I want you to hear this, that the whole idea with a lot of this stuff, when I sit down with those guys and I share this stuff, when I share with those guys how I'm doing physically, emotionally, spiritually, what I've been struggling with, I don't really want them to fix me. I don't really want them to tell me what to do. Now, there's a time and a space for people to speak into my life and say, "Hey, David, bro, let's pump the brakes here. Let's talk about this." There's absolutely a time and a space for that. But generally speaking, the whole idea with this exercise isn't to fix people, but it's for people to be heard and understood. So that's the idea. It's not to fix people. It's just to generally be heard and understood. And so normally when we do this, we'll sit down, and so let's say I shared with my boys, this is how I feel physically, this is how I feel spiritually, this is how I feel emotionally, this is what I've been struggling with. And basically they're just kind of listening. Where they need to ask some clarification questions, they'd ask them. And normally they kind of communicate back to me, "Okay, so this is what I heard you say. Is that right?" And I say, "Yeah, that's exactly what I said." Or, "No, this is actually really what I meant." This exercise has been a game changer for me. I mean, it is... I would say it's not a silver bullet. This stuff isn't a silver bullet for fixing your life, but it's been really helpful for me. And it has been really helpful for my friends from church and for my roommate. And I'll say that I would imagine there's some people sitting in this room who probably feel the way that I felt that day when I was sitting in that office with that counselor. Where you just kind of... Maybe you kind of struggle with the idea that if people really knew you, if they really knew the things you thought, they really knew the desires you had, the motivations you had, the things you did behind closed doors, they'd run for the hills. And I kind of had this idea in my head for a long time that, I can be known and loved by God, but I can't be known and loved by people. I don't really feel that anymore. And the reason I don't feel that anymore is because over and over and over and over again, week after week, I've sat down with a group of men I really trust and I really care about. And man, I've put it out there. I've been honest. I've been honest about the motivations, the desires, the ugly stuff. And I've over and over and over again watched those guys hear me say those things and go, "Man, thanks for saying that, but that doesn't scare me off." I think we need that. We need people in our lives to see the ugliest parts of us. And for them to respond by going, "Yeah, man, I get that, but I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, bro." That's been kind of life-changing for me. And honestly, it's helped me. I would say it's helped me understand God's grace even more, because I'm physically experiencing grace. I'm physically experiencing an example of someone seeing the ugliest parts of me, and instead of running away, they're actually moving closer. And so I really want this to be part of your lives. I want to see y'all be people who don't just pursue spiritual health, but pursue emotional health, and are able to communicate this kind of stuff that's going on in your heart. I remember I once had to write a paper for a class that I was taking, and for this class I had to interview a handful of guys, and so this paper I was writing it on an ethical issue that we deal with a lot in our job. And so just because I meet with so many guys who struggle with pornography, I was like, well, that's what I'll write my paper about. So I wrote my paper about how to help young men take steps towards freedom from pornography. And one of the guys I interviewed, I will never forget this, and I use this as a constant gauge in my own life. And what he said to me, he said, "David, I think that I think that when we have an honest and a healthy relationship with God, and we have honest and healthy relationships with other people in our lives, we're going to be okay. We're going to be content. Doesn't mean life's always going to be fun or easy. But if I'm at a place where I have an honest and a healthy relationship with God, an honest and healthy relationship with other people, I'm going to be okay. And I want to stand in front of you and attest to the fact that's been true for my own life. So we've got 13 minutes. So what we're going to do, I want you to split up into groups of 3 plus or minus 1 person. So anywhere from 2 to 4. Girls, I want you to get with girls. Guys, you get with guys. And we're going to practice this. So we're going to practice what we call the check-in. So the check-in is where you sit down with a group of people and you say, this is how I'm feeling physically, this is how I'm feeling spiritually, this is how I'm feeling emotionally, this is what I've been struggling with. And kind of what I said, you're listening, you're not trying to fix, you're just trying to hear. So we're going to practice. So, split up into groups, find 3 people. If we need, it seems like we probably need to spread out outside of the door. I'll kind of